Gaming history is full of stories that should never have happened. Games that launched to terrible reviews, crushing sales numbers, and brutal community backlash, only for the exact same games to be celebrated as absolute masterpieces just a few years later. The gaming community got it wrong, the critics got it wrong, and the developers who poured years of their lives into these games watched helplessly as the world rejected something genuinely special before it ever got a fair chance. But here's the thing about great games. They don't stay buried forever. Word spreads, updates improve, second chances happen, and some of gaming's most beloved titles today are games that were practically written off at launch. Today, we're telling those stories. These are the games that flopped at launch, got dismissed by everyone, and turned out to be absolute masterpieces all along. Let's get into it. Prey launched in 2017, carrying a name that worked against it before anyone even played it. Most people assumed it was a sequel to a completely unrelated 2006 shooter. Arcane's actual game was a brilliant immersive sim set on a space station overrun by shape-shifting aliens, built in the spirit of System Shock. Confusing marketing and a name mix-up buried it commercially, and it sold far below expectations, despite critics praising its design. A true sequel never got greenlit, and the studio moved on to other projects. But among immersive sim fans, Prey quietly became a benchmark, praised for its glue gun mechanics and level design that rewards exploration over combat. In 2026, it's still considered one of the most underrated games Arcane ever made. Assassin's Creed Unity launched in November 2014 in one of the most infamously broken states in AAA history. Faces melted off characters, players fell through the Paris map, and frame rates dropped low enough to become a meme overnight. Ubisoft was forced to publicly apologize and gave the game away free to Season Pass holders as compensation. Underneath the chaos was actually a huge leap for the series, a genuinely massive recreation of revolutionary Paris and some of the best parkour traversal Assassin's Creed has ever had. Ubisoft spent months patching it into a completely different game. Years later, players who go back to Unity now find one of the most visually stunning entries in the franchise, buried under its own launch disaster. Death Stranding launched in 2019 to one of the most divided receptions in gaming. Half the reviews called it a masterpiece. The other half called it a walking simulator with a delivery job attached. Kojima's first project after leaving Konami was strange by design. Slow, methodical, built around connection instead of combat. A lot of players bounced off it in the first few hours and wrote it off as boring. The ones who pushed through found a genuinely emotional story about isolation and rebuilding a broken world, tied together by a system where other players' structures quietly appear in your own game. The director's cut expanded on it further, and by 2026, Death Stranding is regularly cited as one of the most unique games ever released. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy launched in October 2021 to some of the best reviews of any Marvel game, and almost nobody bought it. Square Enix had banked on the game landing in a crowded release window, right next to Halo Infinite and other big titles, and it got lost immediately. Square Enix publicly called the sales disappointing, and the fallout contributed to studio layoffs down the line. What players missed was a genuinely funny, emotionally sharp Star-Lord story with a killer 80s soundtrack and combat that never overstayed its welcome. It didn't get the numbers it deserved, but critics and the players who found it still call it one of the best Marvel games ever made. Nier Automata released in 2017 as a sequel to a game most people had never even heard of, the original Nier, which flopped so hard in 2010 it nearly ended the franchise. The PC port of Automata launched in an especially rough state, capped at 60 frames per second improperly, missing basic options, and riddled with bugs that took the community itself to fix through unofficial patches. Despite that, players who pushed through discovered one of the most philosophically ambitious action games ever made, blending existential storytelling with android combat across multiple playthroughs that completely changed the meaning of the story. Word of mouth turned it into a phenomenon. Nearly a decade later, Nier Automata is considered one of the most important games of its era.
Sunset Overdrive launched in 2014 as an Xbox One exclusive, and that alone limited how many people ever played it. Insomniac built a wildly colorful, irreverent open-world shooter with some of the best traversal mechanics ever made, grinding rails, bouncing off cars, and chaining kills with ridiculous weapons. Critics love the personality and style, but sales never matched the ambition, partly because it launched on a console many players hadn't bought yet. A sequel never got greenlit, and the game slowly faded from mainstream conversation. Ironically, Insomniac carried lessons from its traversal design straight into Spider-Man. In 2026, Sunset Overdrive still has a passionate cult following demanding a proper follow-up.
Sleeping Dogs almost never existed. It started as True Crime Hong Kong, got cancelled by Activision, and was rescued at the last minute by Square Enix. When it finally launched in 2012, it was overshadowed by bigger open-world releases and struggled commercially despite strong reviews. Players who picked it up found a brutally satisfying martial arts combat system, a genuinely gripping undercover cop story, and one of the most authentic depictions of Hong Kong in any game. It didn't sell like a blockbuster, but the people who played it never forgot it. A planned sequel was later shut down. Today, Sleeping Dogs is remembered as one of the most underrated open-world games of its generation.
Titanfall 2 released in October 2016, squeezed between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and it got crushed. Despite one of the best campaigns in shooter history and movement-based multiplayer that fans still call unmatched, sales were disastrous. Respawn and EA had picked the worst possible release window, and the game never got the audience it deserved. Critics loved it immediately, praising the campaign's creativity and the multiplayer's skill ceiling, but praise doesn't always translate to players. Titanfall 2's community stayed loyal for years, keeping the servers alive through sheer persistence. Even now in 2026, it's regularly cited as one of the greatest shooter campaigns ever made, a masterpiece that launched at exactly the wrong time. Mad Max released in September 2015 on the exact same day as Metal Gear Solid 5, and it never stood a chance. Avalanche Studios built a genuinely great open-world wasteland game. Brutal vehicle combat, satisfying car customization, and a gritty tone true to the films. But almost nobody noticed. It got buried under the hype for Kojima's Swan Song and faded from conversation within weeks. There was no big scandal here, just terrible timing that killed its commercial momentum. Years later, players going back to it found a tightly designed action game that holds up far better than its reputation suggests. In 2026, Mad Max is one of the most recommended hidden gems in the open-world genre.
Fallout New Vegas launched in 2010 in such a broken state that Obsidian barely had time to fix it before the deadline. Constant crashes, save corruption, and quest-breaking bugs made it nearly unplayable on consoles at release. Critics were harsh, and Bethesda docked Obsidian's bonus over a single missed review point. But underneath the mess was the smartest writing the Fallout series has ever had. A morally gray Mojave wasteland where every faction had a real argument for why they should win. Patches and dedicated modders eventually smoothed out the technical issues, and the writing did the rest. More than 15 years later, New Vegas is still considered by many the best Fallout game ever made. Days Gone launched in 2019 to a wave of harsh reviews, calling it generic and unfinished. Performance issues, awkward pacing, and a slow opening made critics dismiss it as just another zombie game riding on Sony's coattails. Players who stuck around found something different, a surprisingly emotional story about grief, survival, and loyalty set in the Pacific Northwest, backed by some of the best horde-based combat ever built. Word of mouth kept the game alive long after review scores faded, and it quietly became one of PlayStation's best-selling titles ever. Bend Studio pitched a sequel that Sony rejected, but fans never stopped asking. In 2026, Days Gone still has one of the most vocal, loyal communities in gaming.
Reddit called it No Man's Sky within a week of launch. No Man's Sky launched in August 2016, promising infinite procedurally generated planets, deep multiplayer, and a living universe. What players got was a barren, buggy game missing half the features shown in trailers. The backlash was brutal, Steam refunds spiked, and Hello Games' Sean Murray disappeared from public view for months. Instead of shutting down, the small studio kept working in silence. Foundation, Next, Beyond, and dozens more free updates rebuilt the game piece by piece, adding real multiplayer, base building, and living worlds nobody expected. A decade later, No Man's Sky is widely regarded as gaming's greatest redemption story, still getting free content updates in 2026.
This game got pulled from the PlayStation Store. Cyberpunk 2077 launched in December 2020 as one of the most broken AAA releases in history. PS4 and Xbox One versions crashed constantly, glitched through walls, and ran at unplayable frame rates. Sony pulled it from the PlayStation Store entirely, and CD Projekt Red's stock crashed overnight. Refunds flooded in. Reviewers called it a scam, but the team didn't walk away. Over the next few years, patch after patch fixed the foundation, and the 2.0 update alongside the Phantom Liberty expansion transformed Night City into one of the most immersive open worlds ever made. By 2026, Cyberpunk 2077 sits among the highest-rated RPGs of the generation, proof that a broken launch doesn't have to be the final verdict.
Vampire launched in 2018 to a mixed reception. Criticized for clunky combat, technical performance issues, and a stealth system that felt undercooked next to its ambitions. Dotnot built a genuinely difficult moral system underneath it, though. Every character in plague-ridden London could be killed for resources, and every choice permanently changed the city around you. Reviewers focused on the rough edges and largely missed how meaningful those choices actually felt. Commercial performance was modest, and a sequel never materialized. Years later, players revisiting Vampire found an atmospheric, morally complex RPG that took real risks other games were too safe to attempt. In 2026, it's often mentioned as one of the most slept-on RPGs of its generation. Spec Ops: The Line was marketed in 2012 as just another generic military shooter. Brown and gray corridors, cover-based combat, nothing that stood out on a shelf full of Call of Duty clones. That marketing killed it commercially before players discovered what was actually inside. The game deliberately used the tropes of the genre to tell a brutal story about the horror of war and the lies soldiers tell themselves, culminating in one of the most controversial and talked about sequences in gaming history. Sales were poor enough that the studio moved away from the franchise entirely afterward, but critics and players who experienced it never stopped talking about it. Over a decade later, Spec Ops: The Line is taught in game design courses as a masterclass in subverting expectations.